Hello, and welcome back to Missouri Civil War. Today I want to continue with our discussion of the challenges faced by Union authorities, with perhaps the most consequential issue of the entire struggle, that of the fate of slavery. We'll begin with the divided opinions among federal leaders about how to deal with slavery in general, and in particular with the growing number of fugitive slaves who appeared behind Union lines. The central point that I want to emphasize is that opinions about this changed. Most importantly, the opinion of Abraham Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation that he issued was a watershed moment, and one that demonstrated how the war to save the Union had also become a war to bring freedom to millions of enslaved Americans. The direct impact of that measure upon Missouri, however, was intentionally limited, and we consider the tortuous and uneven path toward emancipation within the state. We'll look next at how Missourians wrestled with the question of military service by African American men. The argument that the United States ought to allow black soldiers to fight met sharp resistance, even from many Unionists. By 1863, though, a significant number of black volunteers emerged to challenge such doubts. A question that I like to ask my students every semester is, who freed the slaves? Was it Lincoln, the famed great emancipator? Does credit belong with the anti-slavery activists in the North, who were radical for their day and in many ways years ahead of the president on questions of racial equality? Was it the Union soldiers who made emancipation real? Or was it the former slaves themselves, the countless men and women who seized the opportunity to win their freedom by running away, putting their own safety and lives on the line to destroy slavery from within? Historians continue to disagree about how much emphasis ought to be given to each factor, and you can decide for yourself which deserves the most credit. The key point, though, is that there are many forces at play, pulling slavery down by the midpoint of the Civil War. At the start of his presidency, when 7 states in the Deep South had already seceded, Lincoln steadfastly assured Southerners that he did not intend to destroy slavery where it existed. In his inaugural address, the first of 2, as it would turn out, he even went so far as to endorse a proposed constitutional amendment that would protect slavery and to ensure its survival, perhaps into the 20th century. This failed 13th Amendment is still one of the most curious and thankfully failed revisions to our Constitution. Yet as a Republican candidate, Lincoln also maintained his opposition to the spread of slavery. Despite the Supreme Court declaration and the Dred Scott ruling that Congress could not legally regulate slavery in the West, Lincoln's anti-slavery sensibility was one of the foundations of his political worldview. The war, of course, changes things. And there's your pithy bumper sticker for what Dr. Neely's course or any history course taught you. Things changed. Helpful, isn't it? Lincoln evolves, as Eric Foner describes in his powerful book, The Fiery Trial. And the president in 1862, 63, 64 would see that changing circumstances warranted bolder action against the slaveholders who were waging war against the United States. Congress moved more aggressively against slavery. It passed the first Confiscation Act in August 1861. This bill authorized federal troops to seize slaves employed by the Confederate Army. It did not explicitly grant them freedom. There was this ambiguity among Northerners about what to do with ex-slaves. At this time, there were still some Union officers who were returning fugitives to their masters, according to the Fugitive Slave Act. A second Confiscation Act came in July 1862, and it extended the existing policy to include the slaves of disloyal masters anywhere, not just those employed by the rebel army. It also declared these people to be forever free. Lincoln signed the Second Confiscation Act with some ambivalence and nearly vetoed it. Through the summer of 1862, Lincoln continued to urge congressmen from border states to accept a plan of incremental and compensated emancipation. He floated this plan 3 times. and each time the border states rejected it. This, plus changing military realities, kindled a shift in perspective amongst Lincoln's cabinet. There are two things, I think, that mattered a great deal to the president. The most important factor was the actions of slaves themselves. And the second was the fact that the end of the war yet seemed distant. As politicians in the North and in the border states wrung their hands over this question, the war and the thousands and thousands of escaped slaves who seized upon its chaos to gain their freedom, this forced Union officers and soldiers to deal with these big questions. What should federal troops do with the swelling tide of fugitives? Return them to their masters? Risk their labors being used to support the Confederacy and its disloyal supporters? To keep these contrabands, enemy property, would bring real hardships to the South. Yet, we're not just talking about property. These were human beings. Was the Army obligated to recognize their freedom, to feed them, to care for them? We've already seen how Jayhawking, Kansas, volunteers functioned as an army of liberation. And that illustration shows us how escaped slaves and Union forces worked hand in glove to destroy slavery in western Missouri. And as these forces worked together, the question of emancipation becomes unavoidable. And here's another point about the political context in the North during the war's second year. At this point, federal troops had won few major victories, particularly in the East. There was no clear sign that the war would end anytime soon, at least successfully. And there was real frustration mounting amongst Northerners who saw their sons dying in large numbers with no end in sight. The military advantage that emancipation might confer upon the Union Army to shift the tide of war becomes key. Yet such a bold move was bound to be controversial, and Lincoln sensed that he needed at least one key victory to provide him with some political cover. That victory came in September 1862 with the Union triumph at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. On September 22nd, President Lincoln announced that on January 1st, 1863, slaves in much of the Confederate South would be freed. The proclamation did not free all the slaves. It excluded enslaved people living in areas that were already under Union control, including parts of Virginia and Louisiana. It also excluded slaves in Kentucky and Missouri. So 1862 and 1863, this is a period of transition. On one hand, Lincoln is now willing to endorse emancipation as a matter of military necessity. But on the other hand, he still feared that aggressive action might push the loyal slave states into the Confederacy. In time, as we'll see, he puts aside those fears. First, though, let's step back and see how events within the state pushed it toward emancipation. There were public officials in Missouri who had advocated gradual emancipation. They included Senator B. Gratz Brown, Congressman Henry Blau, State Representative John D. Stevenson. The provisional governor, Hamilton Gamble, rejected this proposal. For many conditional Unionists, protecting slaveholders' rights was one of the, if not the, condition of their loyalty. Slavery, however, was beginning to collapse in much of outstate Missouri. In addition to the thousands of slaves who ran away, some masters moved their slaves out of the state. Some slaves were sent to Kentucky, where they might fetch higher sale prices. Others went further south, lest they fall into hands of marauding Union troops. The owner of slave Richard Kimmons, for example, sent him south to Texas, leaving crops standing in the field for that reason. Unionist authorities in Missouri passed a statewide emancipation bill in 1863. It was a fairly weak law. It declared that no slaves in Missouri would be freed until 1870. Those older than 40 would remain slaves for life. Those under 12 would not be freed until the age of 23. In the meantime, the slave trade would not be restricted. And even after 1870, slave trade between residents of Missouri would remain legal. And much of this was part of a familiar pattern. As nearly every northern state had emancipated its slaves after the Revolution, they had done so in this kind of incremental fashion. In Missouri's case, this 1863 half measure would not be the end. As the struggle over emancipation sharpened the conflict, Lincoln appointed John Schofield to command the Department of Missouri, hoping that the West Point graduate could restore order out of the chaos in Missouri. Schofield, however, served to accelerate this trend toward emancipation. He authorized Colonel William Pyle of the 33rd Missouri Volunteers not only to free, but to recruit black troops in the most disloyal parts of the state. Governor Gamble consented to this confiscation, but only if the slaves of loyal masters were not taken, and if the black regiments would not be credited to the state of Missouri. As a result, Pyle designated most of these men recruited in Missouri as Arkansas volunteers. The enlistment of black troops was especially controversial. There was a kind of paradox within the racist attitudes of many whites in Missouri and beyond. Fears of an armed black insurrection had long gripped the slaveholding South. Think here about Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion. Many whites, though, doubted that African Americans had the courage or the capacity to fight as effective soldiers. Events in western Missouri soon proved otherwise. By 1862, hundreds and then thousands of Missouri slaves fled to freedom in Kansas. Field commanders asked for permission to put freed people to work on behalf of the Union. James Lane, he of the Jayhawker Raid of 1861, began to recruit African American volunteers for his 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. These would be some of the first black recruits in the whole country. It wasn't until early 1863 that the U.S. Army would accept black troops. On October 29, 1862, men of the 1st Kansas Colored clashed with pro-Confederate guerrillas near Island Mound in Bates County, Missouri. This skirmish was brief, and it resulted in few casualties. But it was a momentous event because it marked, for the first time during the entire Civil War, when black troops saw combat. That's a distinction that's usually given to the men of the 54th Massachusetts, who became popular in the film Glory. But the fight at Island Mound came 8 months earlier. One of the guerrillas who witnessed the fighting at Island Mound described the ferocity of the hand-to-hand combat there. The black troops, he noted, fought like tigers. Once Unionist recruiters had enlisted practically all of the slaves of identifiably disloyal masters, they turned toward enticing or forcing the slaves of loyal owners into service as well. Schofield found himself caught in the middle here. He was personally opposed to slavery, but he was also a close friend of the conservative provisional governor. The general thought that loyal owners ought to be compensated, with the sum to be set by the Secretary of War and then paid from the substitute fund, created whenever wealthy citizens paid a fee in order to avoid service. Missouri slaveholders appealed to Lincoln, and the president ordered his officers to curtail these kinds of recruitment efforts. There was strong support for enlisting black troops among more radical Republicans. On September 1st, Charles Drake said, "I have no squeamishness about arming the Negro. I am no half-breed Unionist, sensitive about seeing white men fight alongside the American citizen of African descent. No traitor is too good to be killed by a Negro, nor has any traitor a right to insist on being killed by a white man." Later that fall, an election for state judges saw unconditional Unionists run very well, and this convinced Lincoln that there was now enough political support to recruit more Missouri slaves. On November 14th, Schofield issued Orders Number 135, which authorized the state provost marshal to recruit black troops, whether free or enslaved, regardless of a master's loyalty. This order was less effective than its supporters had hoped. Opposition from conservative provost marshals hindered its implementation. Some spoke out against recruitment. Others did nothing to inform enslaved Missourians they could even enlist, and they refused to accept some African American volunteers. The Boone County Provost Marshal went so far as to prohibit the enlistment of Boone County slaves anywhere else. A more dangerous threat to recruitment came from the slave patrols that formed in rural Missouri. White guerrillas attacked black recruits, killing many of them, and warned others of the dangers of enlistment. In central Missouri, slave patrols warned would-be recruits that federal officers would place black troops at the front lines and then pay them nothing. Their families, as this story went, would be left behind to starve. And after the war, Lincoln would surely sell them back into slavery. Recruitment by Union agents was thus haphazard, but black volunteers nevertheless took matters into their own hands. According to the Kansas City Daily Journal of Commerce, everywhere throughout the state, Negroes are coming forward with alacrity to enroll themselves in the service of the government. Said a St. Louis paper, the patriotic fever is running high among Africa's sable sons. For African Americans, military service represented their surest claim to freedom and even equality. And the efforts of black soldiers and sailors would be a key factor in turning the tide of war toward the Union's favor. By the war's end, Missouri would furnish for the Union some 8,300 black soldiers across 5 regiments. Yet that number understates the number of formerly enslaved people in the state who volunteered to fight, because most of the African American men recruited in Kansas, Illinois, and Iowa had escaped from slavery in Missouri. This shift toward emancipation, including the enlistment of black troops, represented a key tipping point in Missouri's Civil War. Yet even as the state was turning toward freedom in this sense, much of it was simultaneously collapsing into chaos and terror. For next time, we evaluate that descent into guerrilla violence. Until then.